there's nothing new about the term metaverse. It's really just the sum of technological advances of the internet that makes, high concurrency, user count environments. I think gamers should not be paid.
Hey friends, welcome to Smart Venture Podcast, the best information for future CEOs. Starting a company is easy, but growing and managing it is hard. In this podcast, we sit down with the best founders, experienced leaders, and investors in tech and relevant space to give you the best tips to grow your company and grow yourself. Some of our most popular episodes are about crypto founders and investors. Check out our new podcast called Keeping Up with Crypto on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and give it a 5-star. This episode is brought to you by Momento NFT. Momento NFT is a direct-to-fan social NFT app that allows fans to own viral moments from their favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets, autographed merchandise, and more. As a creator, you can easily create valuable images and video NFTs of your best social content. And as a fan, you can own viral moments from your favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets. Momento NFT is backed by Animoca brand, Cadenza, and Mark Pincus. Check out the app available on App Store and Google Play. For the audience who don't know Moritz, I'm going to give you guys a TLDR from my perspective. So Moritz started in Germany as a gamer, and then he was the world-class champion in certain games, and he will be talking about later on. And basically, he was a gamer, and then he was the first high school grad in his family coming from Germany to the US, and he graduated from Stanford Business School. He went on to work at IBM, Goldman Sachs, and now he is a partner at a leading gaming venture capital firm. To start the show, I would love for Moritz to share a little bit more about your journey, where you come from to where you are now, and what are something that you feel like make a big impact in your life.
Now you make it sound like a fairy tale. There were
it is a fairy tale, though.
There were certainly things that didn't work out. I wouldn't call it humble beginnings, but grew up in a small town near Hanover, which is a city in Germany that everyone makes fun of for nothing there ever happening. In our little town, we had more cows than people, and luckily we got connected to the internet in 2000, I believe, which was only 5 years after receiving our own zip code, and that access to the internet I really enjoyed, simply because also the physical environment was not particularly exciting to me. And I dove really deep into video games. As you mentioned, I wasn't a world champion in multiple games, but one, at least in 2003 and 2004, Diablo 2 was kind of like my passion project. And I really played it a lot, mostly because I enjoyed it so much. That became a bit of a professional pursuit, became also a means of financing for the undergraduate and graduate studies later on. So, the early days of play to earn gaming, so to speak, the Wild West of play to earn gaming, when back in those days you didn't really own what you had in the game, but it didn't prevent people from paying real money for it, which is also something we could talk about later on. But that formed a lot of, I think, passion around excellence, passion for trying to really dissect a game to its core principles and then trying to put it together in a way in which other people might not be thinking about it. And then I think really over the last 20 years, that mindset or that training, if you want to call it that, for me, expanded from just playing a video game to also thinking about your personal development, your career, the friendships and the relationships that you want to build in life. And I think also simply what you even shoot for. Because I think once you are exposed to an environment where with the right effort and thinking creatively, a lot more things are possible than most people expect or have as part of their purview, then why not also try the same for landing a job or getting into the school of your dreams or starting up something or building something that other people would think is crazy, or even moving to the United States, which I did by myself pretty much. Yeah.
Wait, I have so many questions there. When you were a kid, you were playing all these games. Were your strategy just be like, this is a numbers game. I'm going to try 5 different games and then see which one I'm going to I'm going to stand out? Or were you just heavily spending time each game and one of them took off? That kind of increased your ability because you were practicing on every game.
anyone who competes on the professional level, which is probably the top 0 point, a couple zeros, 1% level, you kind of have to hone in on a single video game. Just like athletes focus on one sport. I think there are a few standout athletes that actually have been professional in different disciplines. And we see the same thing in esports. But for me, Diablo 2 started as a passion project. I just really liked the game. I still today think it's the greatest game ever built. You know, they just remastered it after 20 years, and not a lot of games get remastered. I think Blizzard really created something very special. And I just loved the game. And I think that's where the drive initially came from. But there certainly was a fascination once you get pretty good and once you get to the top 1%, let's say, and once you appear in global rankings, which were built into the game. I think the top 1,000, if I remember correctly, top 1,000 players were actually listed in the internet version of the game. You kind of try and see if you can make it all the way to the top. And then it becomes much more of a dedicated effort. There's a lot of discipline and hard work in it. There's a lot of things in that aren't necessarily fun, but then the fun is kind of like derived from the meta game. The fun is actually figuring it out to get there.
So back in time, were you playing game to compete? Why do you play game? Motivation wise? And then the other part is it's kind of like so bizarre that like you're playing a video game and then the video game funded your journey to, school. And those are very unique situation to a lot of people. Basically, you're saying that like because of those experiences are so unique, why not apply that mentality into work and life? What was that mentality? Was it more like I can make it anywhere if I can make it in gaming, or like, because of like, my approach is really unique, but like, because that doesn't really align with future working at like the top tech company or when you went to the top business school. I'm curious, what was something there that you kind of like apply into everything in life?
Yeah. I just want to emphasize again, I think it was fun and joy that then certainly triggered a certain competitive nature, right? Like I would lie to you if I told you I wasn't in it also for the competitive elements. And even the games I play today, I really like Rocket League. That's something I still play. At my age, it's pretty rough, because I get beaten up by teenagers every day. And I try not to yell at them. But the way I look at this is kind of like everyone's often trying to solve for like a local optimum. But to get to the very top, you kind of have to solve for global optimum. So if you kind of if you look at it in math terms, you might be trying to play a game in a way that others have already figured out is a viable way of playing this game. And you're just going down that path and you're trying to do it really well. But what's the ceiling? It's kind of like the ceiling is the path that others have already walked or that others have embarked on a year earlier and are now refining. But the best players in the world for games like, Rocket League is a great example where what we call the meta, which is basically the efficiency frontier, the best way of playing the game, continuously evolves. Even if you look at the champions from the first season or the second season, you might look at it today as a decent player and wonder, really, that's how good they were only, versus a couple of years later where mechanics have gotten so crazy and there's so much knowledge built around ways to outsmart the opponent that are now table stakes, where to be truly on the top, you really have to take the whole thing apart and try and put it back together in a way that no one else thinks about it, really perfect that, and use that as a competitive strategy. And to come to your broader question, I really oftentimes think of trying to looking at life as pursuing that global optimum, where the typical thing would be to look at the local optimum, which is to go the standard path and do it really well, because that's what everyone says and that's what most people do. And it's still hard to do it well. And I've obviously done traditional stuff, right? Like business school, Goldman. But there's all kind of other examples, I think, in my career and in life and in, sports, where you literally just ignore what is normal or common. And you look at things with a clean slate and you just dissect it and you argue from first principles and you come up with maybe initially ridiculous things that as you embark on then you realize they're actually pretty obtainable.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So that's so philosophical. Okay. So number one, what exactly is first principle? And because I feel like I heard about this from you and some other billionaires and basically on our show, they mentioned about first principle. And then the other part is in terms of gaming, why is gaming a sport? And then I've heard the founder of Axie, I believe you guys probably invest in them. So the founder of Axie told us basically people play game to achieve flow state. And then, the second week, like the last week, Kevin Cho come on our show, like he's the founder of Capam and Rally and Forte. So basically he was saying that people are playing game to compete. So like, I think like it's very different from flow state perspective. I'm curious, what are the intrinsic things that like games bring to people? You mentioned like a little bit competitiveness, a lot of it, or maybe fun. Why do people play game? Why is gaming such a huge sector? Even in the economic downturns, it's like still really performing really well compared to other type of entertainment.
Yeah, there were a few questions in there, so I'll try and touch on all of them. Quickly on the first principles, I mean, my interpretation is simply looking at problems or opportunities at face value and really just using pure reasoning and deduction when trying to analyze certain problems and ignoring completely what I guess people would call common sense. Which is actually typically a bunch of people that made poor decisions, but made them often enough so it became the standard. On gamer motivations, and when we talk a lot about that when we make investments at BITKRAFT, I think it's really important to point out there are many different motivations that bring people to play video games. There are certainly those that thrive on the competition. I'm one of them, but I wouldn't even say that's my main driver. Even for me personally, I think just having fun is so much more important to me than the competitive element. There are others that like to be collectors. There are people that like to be explorers. There are people who like single player games, and there are people who wouldn't play anything but multiplayer games. There's obviously PC, console, mobile, and now we have VR and AR. So it's just like saying, why do people watch TV? I mean, it really depends. Some like documentaries, some like sitcoms. Why is gaming so popular right now? I think the simplest explanation to me is it's just a better form of media. It simply rules supreme to any other media category. We had the transition from TV to on-demand entertainment, where we moved from linear, i.e., you tell me when you have time and then I'll tell you what's in for you, what the programming has right now. Seems flawed for people who only have 30 minutes, an hour at the end of their day. And so I guess our entire generation shifted to on-demand entertainment, short-form content, TikTok, etc., Netflix. And then if you look at gaming, it's also on demand, but on top of on-demand, traditional on-demand media like Netflix, it's social. I can enjoy it together with my friends. And, there's obviously a lot of talk about gaming being the next social network. And you look at things like Roblox and Fortnite and Minecraft, and that really brings this idea to life. But it's not only social, it's also interactive. So I can actually partake in my media experience. It's not just unidirectional. So it's on my schedule. All my friends are there, and I can also create, not just consume. There'll always be room for traditional on-demand entertainment. I mean, when I'm tired, I love to watch Netflix too. But if I have 30 minutes in between my meetings, I mean, I might hit up our principal to play a couple of quick games of Rocket League, versus watching YouTube.
Yeah, totally. That's like a really great point about like on demand, or like the general people's like behavior start like shifting. Okay, so back to career development. You've been a great gamer. Later on, you achieve a lot in life. Who is on your personal board of advisors when it comes to career decisions?
I would probably say my wife. She's an entrepreneur as well. We actually met on the Forbes list.
I heard about these things. Like people are there to searching for spouse, but I thought it was just like a joke.
So we met on one of the international trips to Israel, and then started dating as we both realized we were living in New York at the time. The two of us discuss a lot of things, work-related topics, try and help each other. Sees it all from the founder perspective. I see it all from the investor perspective. That also creates an interesting dynamic and perspective sometimes, but she's awesome. And that's my go-to sounding board if I'd have to mention anyone. And then obviously there are a lot of friends, primarily actually entrepreneurs, interestingly, less so investors, that I would discuss important things with.
Yeah, totally. I was wondering, how do you kind of like build this kind of personal board of advisors besides like meeting your wife in the conference?
Yeah, I mean, it somewhat naturally evolved. I think if you make an effort to be part of interesting communities, you have simply a higher probability of running into people that you bond with and build a strong connection. I don't think I'm that pragmatic or planned about building a board of advisors. I plan a lot of things in my life. This is kind of probably one of the things that came out of playing a lot of video games and like trying to over systemize or dissect problems at all times. For about 10 years now, I've actually done this 5-year plan. Usually in December, and it usually takes me about 2 days. I think it was initially suggested by a mentor at IBM when I was in my early 20s. And he asked me, what's your 10-year plan? Back then it was 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I really didn't have one. I was kind of like thinking a year ahead, and planning also was basically career and not life. And I guess that's fair, when you're in your early 20s or academia and work. But there's so much more to life and happiness. So I think over the years, I've expanded to 9 dimensions, including experiences that I want to have with my wife. This includes, meaningful events that I want to plan for with friends, things I want to do with my family was in Germany. So we started having shared vacations, with Elisa's family and my family together as well. And this is all stuff I kind of plan on an annual basis, recurring, and kind of like things move forward. Not everything happens, but I do actually go through this 2-day exercise of really laying out all these dimensions of my life for the next 5 years, and then translating everything into a to-do list. I know this sounds super German, but maybe that gives you like a good insight into the kind of thinking that I really do believe was heavily influenced by video. It's almost like your own skill tree or like kind of character evolution. And I think it's so interesting and important to do this in domains that just span well beyond just your job. And maybe if you're in school, your school life. It doesn't hurt to put things on the map early. You'll also see super interesting connections between areas that you think wouldn't be connected. And even just the exercise of going through this for the 2 days is super helpful and interesting. And then, I'm not scared having 100 or 150 things on my to-do list at any given point in time, simply because they're all not due tomorrow. Some are due in 3 years. Some are due in 2 months. But if I find myself on a weekend and have, 5 hours on a Saturday, Sunday, where I feel relaxed and I look at this list, I'm thinking, are there any of these that can be advanced today? And then, to give you a silly example, like I got a tattoo last year. There was a thing on the list. I always wanted to get a tattoo. And I guess a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I always want to have a tattoo. Okay, so what are the steps involved? You need to find an artist. You need to think about, what you want to have tattooed, how large, where. So those are the next steps, right? So if you find yourself on a Saturday afternoon, why not just browse some local artists? Why not watch, Ink Master on Netflix to get some inspirations and then lock it in, or you either want it or not. So I don't know. I don't know what's the case for waiting.
No, I think it's great that you're like, just like really having a list to like actually checking these things out. Like, on my list, there's like just one thing that's just like, be happy or something. Like, I'm like super big person. I don't know, like what happened to your last name? So like, I thought like it was just like people normally change to the men's last name and you change to your wife's last name. Is this like a country's culture thing or like?
We decided to hyphenate. So my initial last name is Bayer and hers is Lentz, which is actually a German word. She's born in Siberia. She came to the US when she was 3, and her original last name was Jaliens, and they just changed it to Lentz to Americanize it a little bit. It sounds very nice to the German ear because it actually is a poetic way of saying spring in German.
Oh, wow.
Which is pure coincidence. And a lot of people actually think that's my part of the last name, but it's not. And so, we just decided to mesh them together, and go all in on this relationship.
Oh, wow. I thought it was like a culture thing. In terms of like skill wise, like what do you identify as your unfair advantage and how do you leverage that at work?
I think the biggest advantage, if you want to call it that, is I probably have a pretty loud voice inside me that I consider my kind of internal performance improvement engine that's always saying, this is not good enough. Other people are doing that. Why are you not leaning into this? As much as I guess a lot of people who are also on the Forbes list and a lot of people who are relatively successful, you typically also see them being out there quite a bit because a part of this is also sales. And, in all fairness, I would not necessarily consider myself humble externally. And I can easily see how it could come across as, in many cases, being quite opinionated. But internally, the story is extremely different, right? So it's almost like you've created this necessary masquerade for you that works well and advances you in a professional context. And I would say, by and large, leaning in is a good strategy versus opting out, if that can be generalized. But internally, in those scenarios, I might just be like, oh my God, this is a bad idea. Or I'm actually not qualified enough to try what I'm doing right now. So I think that's generally a bit of a superpower to just when you be super honest with yourself or be super critical with yourself. I guess they call it imposter syndrome, even starting at Goldman, feeling like I should not be here. Certainly when I got to Stanford, and I know that probably at least half of the class feels this way. When you learn about your classmates, everyone feels like I should not be here. I certainly felt like I shouldn't be there. I didn't even have a proper undergraduate degree. So, so it was kind of like my chip on the shoulder pre-Stanford.
What do you think the drive come from? Is that like just prove everybody wrong? Or like, is that more like, oh, you want to achieve a lot in life? Like, for example, making the list, including, getting a tattoo or something?
I've struggled with really pinpointing where it comes from. To be perfectly honest, environment that I grew up in was extremely laissez-faire and low pressure. I think you mentioned it briefly in the beginning, but my parents had not finished high school, which wasn't as big of a deal in Germany at the time. The vocational path is a very viable one. And my brother had also dropped out of high school. So my bar was really just finishing high school, which was a bit of a blessing too, because it allowed me to just play a buttload of Diablo 2 while staying in school. So there was no pressure, kind of like parental pressure. There was no pressure from friends or in the environment that I grew up in. So I think honestly, it was probably self-made. And then where does that come from? Maybe genetics play a decent role in this too, And I mean, that's a bigger like nature versus nurture debate. But my brother grew up in the exact same conditions and he's a very different character and we get along super well, but we couldn't be less, I guess, diametrically opposed on a lot of things that we're discussing today. And in the end, everyone is trying to solve for their own happiness. And I think people are just wired in different ways. So I don't know, I'm wired this way.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a bad way to be wired, I guess. I was wondering, so as you mentioned, gaming was not really looked the quote unquote like banking, like sexy character or like in that, like, how do you prove to your team that this is something that we should seriously looking at? What kind of number do you present or do you get a list of clients first? Or like, what exactly do you do there to get this idea on the radar of people who are having the power to, decide which sector to go after?
Yeah. So, I mean, in this case, I think the most telling number was just the TAM, the total addressable market. Gaming at point in time must have had around $140 billion global annual consumer spending. We had a practice for music, which was a $20 billion business at the time. So gaming was 7 times larger than a practice that already existed. You could look at the amount of public companies and private companies. Sometimes like data on private companies is a little bit more difficult to obtain or, imprecise, although for the companies that are worth 200 million and up, it's usually pretty directionally correct. So one thing we also did was basically just lay out all gaming companies north of $200 million in value or like estimated value, both public and private ones. We even had a lot of gaps in our coverage for publicly listed gaming companies. And then the question also is, what is a gaming company even? Is that just game publishers or should you include things like Unity? Roblox was also gaining momentum at the time. So you could show there's extremely large and also among the media categories, the fastest consumer spending in this area. And there are a lot of companies out there that could be acquired, that could go public in the $1 billion range that right now have no one to talk to at Goldman Sachs. And arguably that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, totally. So basically you're saying there's two things, right? Like number one is like gaming, the total addressable market is extremely huge. And then number two, there's like no supply. And then there's like a bonus point, which is like in 2017, gaming as a sector just like kind of blew up for no specific reason, although like gaming has been like sustainably grow for a period of time, for some reason, 2017, just like you guys kind of like caught this giant wave, right?
Yeah, I think, and I also want to make this clear on this call, it's really interesting. As you say, nothing special happened in 2017 revenue-wise, really. And I think actually 2021 is the first down year in gaming since 1997.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and people would not think about it that way. That's in part also because 2020 was such a banger with, social distancing and shelter in place. So it was coming off extremely high numbers. And obviously gaming is doing very well. And I think, aggregate CAGRs over the next few years is back on track around 10% plus. I think what was the big difference is that in 2017, Fortnite, Roblox, and Minecraft all gained significant momentum. And those were all games that were clean and for kids to enjoy and play. And suddenly, all the capital allocation decision makers, people who would run large institutional investors or family offices, or honestly, just really everyone, including a Goldman managing director or partner, suddenly gaming was in their homes. And it's not because they grew up with it, but they couldn't avoid it anymore because their kids were playing this. And that was the big thing that changed in 2017. There was one other dynamic, especially on the esports side, which was that esports leagues started forming and professionalizing, and Riot Games and Blizzard with League of Legends and Overwatch League respectively, and then Call of Duty a little bit later, were basically asking teams to put down $20 million to secure their city spot, to be that team for Los Angeles or New York. And suddenly those teams needed a bit of institutional capital infusion. That's where high net worth individuals, family offices, initially those that, were familiar with the traditional sports ownership side, owners of big football or basketball teams flocking into the space. Those are kind of like the two things from my perspective that happened in 2017. Everyone had it in their homes. Kids were playing. If people weren't already playing themselves, their kids were. And then the institutional investor focus on esports. And then generally, I guess people just throwing games and esports, those terms into the same overall domain.
Yeah, totally. So I have a question. Why is gaming a sport? Is that just because it's competitive? Because when you think about sports, I do think about like the team is one aspect, like the interaction is one aspect. However, it's not really like you're moving your body somewhere. Like you're moving your brain. How does something identify as a sport? And then the second question is like, how do you figure out like what is the most important aspect to pay attention to as investment wise from the business perspective?
First on the topic of whether this is a sport or not, personally, to me, that debate feels settled. I think most people have wrapped their head around the fact that this is a competitive sport. I mean, it's literally in the name of esports. It's an electronic form of sports. I don't know the exact traditional definition of sport. I'm not sure it necessarily involves physical elements, because there are also sports in the traditional environment that I would say don't necessarily involve a lot of physical ability and are stronger on the cognitive side. Gaming certainly is peak performance on cognition, reflexes, quick decision making. The most popular ones are all team based. MOBAs like League of Legends are team-based sports. There are 1v1 sports as well. Rocket League 1v1 is a thing, but the more popular format is 3v3. So I think it's probably fair to say that the vast majority dollar-wise and attention-wise of esports is also team-based, which brings in a whole new dynamic into the skill set that you need to acquire, and one that's actually very similar to what also is popular and efficient in traditional sports. I wouldn't dismiss the physical side of esports either. If you look at the professional teams, by now, they all have a cook. They all have mandatory rest times. I think they track eye movement and other performances and kind of like correlate it with sleep patterns, nutrition, and basically show especially younger players. And most of them are young simply because I think your cognition and reflexes start to decline starting in your early 20s, which is painful to hear, but no worries. We make up for it with wisdom over the years, but like your sheer cognition peaks around 20. And so the best esports players are around that age. And so sometimes they don't necessarily have developed the best behavioral patterns of also taking care of their body, prioritizing sleep. And, traditional teams will be very focused on coaching players on that front as well, simply because the physical side is important. There's the endurance part to it, even simple stuff like hand-eye coordination. I mean, it's a super intense environment, not just cognitively, but physically too. And, oftentimes you have, StarCraft 2 is an interesting example where I believe the best players can get close to 10 actions per second. That's keystrokes, mouse clicks, movement. That's a lot to cram into a second. That's in isolated peak times. That's not for a whole hour or like an extended game session, but micromanagement can get pretty crazy and reach those physical demand levels too. And whenever you ask people for investment advice, this is obviously the one thing that everyone always likes to say is like, it depends. First of all, like the type of investors that we attract at BITKRAFT are institutional investors, family offices, high net worth individuals, many what we call strategics, which are media companies, tech companies, also sports companies that entrust us with their money. Us going out there, especially making investments on the early stage side of things, funding new game studios, new game platforms, new game technologies, and then hopefully returning a multiple to these investors versus, let's say, someone who is younger, doesn't make the cut maybe yet for investing in a venture capital firm and just wants to know what are good stocks to buy, which, I can't and won't advise on a podcast, but there's like so many different philosophies or risk levels to even approach investing with, right? For us and the work we do, our investments are typically categorized into different funds. So today we run 6 funds at BITKRAFT with a consolidated north of $800 million in assets under management. And so each fund will basically build a portfolio of mostly early stage, but also later stage, investments that are all united by the fact that they are all in the gaming industry. Some are IP related. So, experienced or seasoned executives from Riot Games, Epic Games, Blizzard, other companies that are leaving their oftentimes very cushy roles and are betting their future again on starting up and building something truly special and want to find a partner to embark on this journey with. And we work hard to make sure that they would pick us to partner with them on that. And then there are platform and technology companies like Twitch, Discord, Unity that aren't exposed to individual IP, but there are more companies that are filling sometimes empty spots in the gaming industry, services that are interesting, but just not there right now. Discord is a great example for that. Unity and Epic Games Unreal Engine are great examples for just building out tool sets to even create video games. We have investments in different forms of 3D content creation, from volumetric video to AI-assisted creation. We have a company that focuses on creating intelligent characters and non-player characters in virtual worlds. We have companies in augmented reality and virtual reality. And when we think about making a good investment, it's always typically with a 10-year horizon. So the funds, each fund has a 10-year investment horizon. And so the question is, what can we invest in that will yield in the highest return, but not tomorrow or not next year or in 2 years, but really over this 10-year horizon. And so you can afford to make some bets on certain industry trends. The big ones that are going on right now, I would say, are AR and VR as a platform shift, going away from traditional screens to head-mounted devices. Some of them will be reality escapes like Oculus, and some of them will be reality augmentation, like, mixed reality and augmented reality glasses that we will likely see from Apple and Facebook and others in, about 2-3 years. And some other interesting stuff in between. Artificial intelligence is an interesting area. I mean, everyone's talking and hearing about it, but it affects gaming as well, because if we want to build these open, vast worlds, the metaverse is a term that gets thrown around, building all of that from scratch or designing it all from hand is really hard. And so you have to kind of take creation shortcuts. Unity and Unreal help you accelerate your development and build fantastic landscapes relatively easily. Mm-hmm. And now you can do the same for characters and other parts of video game experiences. Blockchain is obviously an interesting topic, and one that gets a lot of attention and funding right now, with this idea of moving digital assets and identities and characters into players' hands. Basically the exact opposite of what I experienced 20 years ago, when what I was playing for and what I was selling for real money was technically never mine. I would say those are the big trends: VR, AR, AI, crypto, and then cloud gaming is another interesting one, where, similar to other media formats, the content and the processing power lives in the cloud. Netflix is a good example of a company that obviously did really well on that front. It's a little bit harder for gaming because it's interactive, but we're on the cusp of figuring that out at scale as well.
Totally. I was wondering, from like a business perspective, how does gaming fitting into the entire ecosystem? Like, how does gaming as an industry generally making money? Are they making money from individuals, or are they making money from B2B perspective? As a gaming company, you are selling equipment or like games to like individuals, right? And then when it comes to now, like when you think about like the metaverse, or like, there's so many iconic brands that tapping into NFT or building their own metaverse, like Gucci, and, like basically all the top brands have some sort of metaverse play. And I'm curious, like, how does gaming shifted as an industry? And then like, what is the metaverse just gaming? Like, how can a brand actually authentically adopt metaverse or Web3 into their strategy?
I'll try and touch on everything again. I think it's fair to say that at least today, the majority of spending is consumer spending. So B2C, not B2B. We actually, at BITKRAFT, we try to take a very holistic perspective on the size of the gaming industry. And that's on our website, bitcraft.vc, and in the insight section, if anyone wants to check that out. But the typical perspective is that it's about a $200 billion industry. But that only includes consumer spending on PC, console, and mobile. That does not, for example, include hardware sales. So it excludes money made with selling a Sony PlayStation or Microsoft Xbox or Nintendo Switch. It also excludes other software domains, and it excludes some B2B, such as Unity or Unreal, for example, and tools like that. It excludes Twitch and Discord. And so we try to kind of like loop it all together. We got to, if I remember correctly, 336 billion, quite a different number than the 200 billion that's typically used. That's how I look at the size, the overall size of the gaming market. And I think 3/4 of that at least is consumer, not B2B, probably even a higher share. Is the metaverse just gaming? Today, I would say yes. It's a super complicated and loaded question because there's not even a real shared definition of the metaverse, but most people today have something comparable in mind, some virtual shared three-dimensional world where we can interact with all different kinds of IP, where we can meet our friends, where we can jump from one experience to another, from games to movies to more social experiences, kind of like a 3D version of a social network. This has been around also for a while, right? Like Second Life most prominently tried to build or arguably build a metaverse. To me, there's nothing new about the term metaverse. It's really just the sum of technological advances of the internet that makes, high concurrency, user count environments possible. Infrastructure advances. It's AR and VR, because typically metaverse people think of extended reality devices and not traditional screens. So that's also heavily influenced by Facebook. And, Apple is pushing in that direction too. That's really just a platform shift. Just like we went from servers to PC to mobile, now we're going to VR and then AR. And I believe ultimately brain-computer interfaces. So no screens at all. And then gaming has just risen in popularity. And you now have a lot more people and a lot more tools building compelling 3D environments. And that's really the sum of things that are happening. And then blockchain is something that's also mentioned oftentimes in conjunction with the metaverse. That's to organize digitally people, but also assets in this new, you could say, in this next version of the internet. But those are all things happening in parallel on different layers, on the content layer, on the platform layer, on the infrastructure layer. And then someone just looked at all of that stuff and then called it the metaverse. You could also say it's just current state or extent of digitization, things moving from the physical to the digital environment.
Totally. So when it comes to investing perspective, how do you mentally compartmentalize which sector to distribute the more amount of money compared to others? There's two giant trends I've seen throughout in the industry, throughout the leaders I've chatted with. Because of its economic downturn, so a lot of people started investing in infrastructures instead of like a lot of consumer driven product. Like people are looking at, what are the back layer technology related stuff that can power gaming or like can power crypto in general. Like, and then the second trend I've seen is like, through my conversation with like the Sarah of Notion or like, partner at Deceiba. So like basically I've seen like B2B SaaS software, they are really paying attention to community. I would not say like they're trying to sell their products throughout like, TikTok or whatever, but it's more like they build a developer community and then maybe they're selling software that way instead of traditionally like doing some sort of marketing that's kind of outbound. They're really focusing on like the community building aspect. Do you see those trends in gaming, and how do you think of gaming as an industry in general in terms of investing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the first thing about gaming and crises and what to do as a gaming investor in a crisis, I think the most important thing to point out is that gaming has actually done really well in crises. Gaming went up in 2000 and 2001. It went up in 2008, 2009, and went up in 2020. So these were times where macroeconomically we were struggling, but also other media formats were struggling. And why is that? My thesis is that when consumer spending gets tight, it comes back to the fact or perspective that I mentioned earlier. It's just a better media format. When you have to think twice how to spend your $20, because right now those $20 are all you want to spend. Usually you would spend $100 in a month on entertainment, and now you can spend 20. Well, would you really want to go to the movies and be entertained for 2 hours and spend $20 on that? Or do you maybe buy an indie game for $20 on Steam that will entertain you for 50 hours, 100 hours that you can enjoy with your friends? It just seems like the better deal. It's just more bang for the buck. And when the economic downturn comes, people care about the bucks just a little bit more. So they think twice. I don't see the case for going to the movies, honestly. I think it's way overpriced. And also people start traveling less, staying at home a little bit more. And it's just, it's an industry that lends itself to people staying inside. Not that I'm saying that that's a good thing, and I love the outside too, but it factors into it as well. So that's kind of like how I looked gaming in crises.
So the second question is, I've seen community building throughout, like the ethos and Web3, as well as like some right now, even like some B2B company too. So what do you think of that in terms of gaming investment side?
There are two parts here. First is that I think generally with blockchain, you have a new and exciting way to incentivize early adopters and people who are true fans. And generally, and this is maybe a separate podcast, but blockchain is really first and foremost, from my perspective, a tool for value distribution, not for value creation. It can be value creating too, but just because a game uses crypto, it doesn't necessarily make it more exciting. What makes a game valuable is the fun that it brings. It's a media category, right? So it's supposed to entertain. And so the value comes from the joy it brings to people in a sustainable, lasting way. Blockchain is interesting because you can now reward people. And we've talked about play to earn gaming. Probably you've had these conversations on the podcast. Also, I think gamers should not be paid. If you're really good at it, you should make a living with it. Like if you are, first of all, if you're an esports athlete, if you're a streamer, but you're also creating, those are cases where you create on top what the game would otherwise be. You are a personality that extends the game. You create the experience of you playing the game that others actually enjoy watching more than maybe playing the game itself. So you're making the game something bigger. Obviously, the same for esports athletes that fill stadiums or stream. But if you're just a regular player, how dare you think you should get paid? Is my perspective, because in the end, money out cannot be larger than money in. So if you want to pay players, which by the way, you could totally do without the blockchain, right? Why don't we have people sign up with their home address for mobile games? And so they get sent checks on a monthly basis for playing the video game. I mean, obviously that's like a pretty costly operation, but it's not necessary to have blockchain to pay your players. I rather think, why should you even want to do that? Why as a player do you even expect to be paid if all you're doing is just playing the game, maybe reasonably well? Because oftentimes you already get the game for free. And now you also want to get paid to play that game that you get for free. So that means if you want more money out, you need more money in. So maybe you need to see more advertisements. So like, I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, right? And like to build that in a sustainable way is hard. And we've seen that in some of the early crypto games where, you know, people have called this Ponzi-nomics, snowball schemes. It's going to take some time to figure this out. But the more interesting way to leverage blockchain, I think, is to reward people who are actually creating something bigger than what the game otherwise would be. Those are, for example, creators in the game that build new levels, build new items that now are available to everyone, that it just makes the game more fun to everyone who's playing it. If you're contributing, I think you should be rewarded and you should get paid because you're making the pie bigger. Similarly, if you're part of the community, if you're an early fan, you're effectively taking a marketing function, a sales function that would otherwise be costly to the company and also creates a larger pie. It means that more players are more likely to play the game. And, you know, you're helping evangelize what you think is a great experience. So that also makes sense to me, to incentivize that and use blockchain to reward those community members. The other thing that's happening and why community is receiving such a big focus, especially for mobile games, IDFA changes have made user acquisition on mobile games just really hard, or rather more expensive than it used to be. So I think game studios, but also other consumer applications by and large are just necessarily getting more creative in how they get the word out there.
Totally. So I was wondering, in terms of building a successful fund in the gaming industry, what is your day-to-day like? And then do you sit there reading industry reports and then go after the 5 company that's on your personal radar? I see you guys' portfolio that's like really, really diverse. That's like basically everything touches game. You guys have some stake in the game. So basically, when it comes to investing strategy, do you personally come with thesis and then like trying to find company that's fitting into the thesis? You see everything and then pick whatever the founder or like the industry that's like more convincing throughout the conversation.
I would say about a quarter of it is building BITKRAFT out as a platform that involves thinking daily about our brand and our reputation, marketing efforts, getting the word out there so that talented founders, when they start up, and if it's a seed round especially, it's inbound, not outbound. When they ask their friends or when they do their own research and think about who could be the best partner for what is this very precious undertaking, that they consider us and they come to us and we hear them out and hopefully also can convince them to work with us. So brand building and platform building is hugely important, especially for specialist funds, because that's all we stand for. Like in the end, our biggest asset is our brand and our people. And so spending time on that also involves raising money into the funds. For a company of our scale, we don't have a separate investor relations or fundraising department yet. So this also primarily falls into partners' hands to make sure there's always enough capital to even deploy. And just for founders to know, we fundraise all the time ourselves. You know, like for us, it's also it's not just deploying capital. That capital also comes from somewhere. And we have pitch decks
100%.
about BitCraft, and we send out pitch decks, and we reach out to institutions and to family offices and to high net worth individuals, and we sell ourselves. Just like our founders sell themselves to us when we're in the critical position that we know from our LPs. So we have to play this game, if you want to call it that, on both sides. And that takes a lot of time. But then obviously the majority of the time is spent on the investing work. So this is twofold. It's inbound and outbound. We are primarily still investing on the early stage side of things, although our tickets have become a lot larger over the years. But this industry has also grown quite a bit. And this, you see larger fundraisers more often. So in those cases, there's no company to hunt per se. You basically need to make sure that you are a good shepherd of the industry and build relationships with companies, build relationship with individuals, and do anything you can do. Also, writing thought pieces about the industry, or just generally being out there as an entity that's involved in the gaming ecosystem, so that people reach out to you when they're ready to start a company. But we wouldn't be able to really front run this in many cases, or actively reach out the other way around, because it's basically the first funding and there's nothing there to hunt before that happens, so to speak. And then, Series A, Series B is a mix of inbound and outbound work, where obviously we have a bunch of internal thesis. We have our clear perspectives on portfolio construction, how much IP, how many platforms, how many tech within IP, what genres, casual versus, core, etc. So, or interesting platforms and technologies that we think are underfunded or important for the industry in rising sectors. And so there we basically map the landscape and we actively reach out to companies. I'd say 2/3 of my investments that I've done for BitCraft so far were inbound and 1/3 was outbound. And then the rest of the time is supporting portfolio companies. So, it doesn't end obviously with the investment, but when we say we're partners on the journey, and BitCraft always had a very, not just a gaming focused mindset, obviously, but also very entrepreneurial and founder supportive mindset. And you'll hear that from a lot of VCs. I would argue, don't listen to me, just talk to our founders. I often say that in competitive pitch situations too. I invite the founders that I'm talking to, that I'm exploring with, whether BitCraft could be a fit for their startup as well. I invite them to talk to our portfolio. And not even us cherry picking certain companies, but them just reaching out, or us making the introduction, solicited or unsolicited. Just talk to the people we work with, talk to the companies that are already BitCraft portfolio companies, and listen to them. And then based on what you hear from them, you can make your decision. So we love helping our companies. And if you ask for competitive advantage, I think we just really work our ass off for our companies. And it comes full circle, I think.
How do you approach who you should raise funding from? Because I think gaming is such an interesting sector that's still really cutting edge. It's not really like, you're raising like a real estate fund or something that like people are extremely familiar with in many, many years. And in terms of selecting these LPs, wouldn't name names, but like there's, big board of trustees of like well-known university, or there is like founder of really big international companies. And how do you guys identify the individuals that would be a good LP? And then like, how do you kind of like, I wouldn't say promise them, but like, what are some outlook that you are trying to achieve throughout the conversation? How do you help them see like what you guys are trying to accomplish?
Yeah, most of the capital in our funds is now institutional capital. So these are actually very well-educated investment firms that in most cases proactively reached out to us. Similar to us, they're screening the market for good investments. Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry.
But for them, a good investment is not a good company, it's a good fund manager. So they're in this one layer removed from us, looking for typically like specialist managers that can bring expertise and unique access to an area that they think is exciting. And gaming checks the boxes for many, I think, these days. I was having conversations in 2017 when I was at Goldman. In addition to my investment banking work, I was helping out a lot on the private wealth management side, because we had a lot of wealthy individuals and family offices call in when gaming and esports. You called out 2017, and I think it's true that if I would have to point to one year, it'd probably be 2017. Everyone called in and wanted to know how to invest in gaming and esports, and no one really knew how to. IP seemed super risky, but then platforms in tech, there are not so many, and so how do you play this? And I was fielding a lot of those conversations, and those were really heavy lifting educational conversations. Oh, what is even esports? And that is a sport now. What's the ecosystem of gaming? How much money goes to the IP holder? Do those other platforms even make money? And so those conversations are all gone. Like when we talk to LPs in 2022, they know exactly what's going on. They have probably spent many, many hours analyzing the gaming sector before they even reach out to us. So you can actually go deep very quickly. And then the question for them is this someone with unique ability to source deals, especially in proprietary situations? Are these people that are smart and knowledgeable and well connected in the industry? And are those people that founders will want to work with? And if you check those boxes, and that's usually the essence of the conversation and their diligence on us, maybe you find yourself with a new limited partner.
Yeah, totally. So when you first encounter other partners at your firm, how did you meet them? And then what were some, how do you, I think meeting someone that you really enjoy chatting with, it's really different than finding a business partner, right? How do you kind of vet, this is the firm that for me? And then, as we have our private conversation about you left a really, quote unquote, very successful looking job, very promising career to, joining a really cutting edge industry that's I wouldn't say have a quote unquote path to success that's looking from outsider looking in, right? I'm curious, what were some, mental conversation that you have with yourself to to figure out this is the path for you?
Yeah, I left Goldman actually in 2019. So there was a gap between Goldman and BITKRAFT. And why I left Goldman, and I think people were also a little bit surprised at Goldman to get that note from me. It was simply that I didn't want to grow old at Goldman. I enjoyed it tremendously. I mean, people talk about it all day long, and the people that talk the most about it never actually worked at an investment bank. But I thought Goldman culture was exceptional. Not just, intense and unique, but also just extremely good. I enjoyed it tremendously. I mean, obviously, you work extremely hard. I think no one's going to be surprised to hear that. But the way in which this intensity was channeled, the people you worked intensely with, and I would say the kindness, the support, and, even the amount of heartfelt moments in crunch time for me in the years that I experienced was awesome. And I came in and I was pretty afraid of what I would get myself into after business school. And I was very positively surprised. But also, I always came in and thought of this maybe a little bit more like a 5-year stepping stone than something I would want to do for the rest of my career. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a banker for 30 years. It's obviously a very lucrative job. And I think a lot of people genuinely also enjoy it. I mean, you have to really like the job to spend a long time there. I think the median tenure is 18 months, So if you're there for 20 or 30 years, then I guess you really like it, And so I left in 2019, as you pointed out. Things were actually going really great. And gaming obviously would have also been an interesting thing to do in 2020, 21, 22, looking at all the M&A deals and IPOs that happened in that time. Obviously, I also oftentimes think it would be fun to kind of work on these transactions. And I wasn't in a rush to find something new. I was pretty okay with also not working for 6 months or even a year. I got reconnected with Jens, who's probably fair to say the key person at BITKRAFT. He's the founder of ESL, which was the first it's called Electronic Sports League, was the first esports tournament organizer and production company, the largest still, I believe. And it was just sold north of $1 billion to the Saudi Arabian PIF. He also founded one of the top performing esports teams globally called G2 Esports. And then in 2016, 17, BITKRAFT, with the idea to be the first dedicated capital provider for esports and gaming. So really a trailblazer in the gaming industry and specifically the esports industry. And we had initial conversations, I think in 2018. We were actually introduced by a mutual connection, which was David Rubenstein and his family office, Declaration Partners, who have been great supporters of BITKRAFT and who used to be at the time, and maybe still are, involved with Goldman as well. So that's how that initially started. And I met Jens again in late 2019 because personally with my wife, we had decided to move to LA before we even had decided what career we would wanted to pursue. And Jens had told me that he was planning to relocate from Berlin to Los Angeles. So I thought it'd be nice to just meet a future neighbor since we'll both be in LA. And then that turned into our conversation. And I came out of that conversation with this teaser and this idea whether I couldn't be handling LA for BITKRAFT, which I always forget to ask him this, but I'm not sure if he went into our 2-hour conversation with that motivation or if it naturally evolved during our discussion. I believe it did, but maybe he's a little bit smarter than I am. And that was, I think, in December 2019 and February 2020 was my first day at BITKRAFT. So only 2 months later, in between meeting the entire team, the other partners and all of the investment team, it was only, I think, 6 or 7 people at the time total. Now with advisors and venture partners, I think we're crossing the 30.
Yeah. Wow. That's super awesome that you have trusted connection to introduce you to someone that was your future partner, which is your current business partner. Within the company, you guys also build a lot of really meaningful relationships, such as with Delphi Digital or with Sony, or basically helping the portfolio company to establish some sort of partnership. Right now, we chat about you guys have to raise funds, you have to become a thought leader. And number one, what's your content diet look like to becoming the expert you are right now? And number two is how do you transform what you know as the industry knowledge into these partnerships or building the relationship with these companies? Either it could be you or when you're running the fund with 3 of your core partners, how do you guys allocate the time and resources to build up these practices as a company technically?
On the expertise and investor acumen side of things, we've all been exposed to the gaming industry for 20 years now. My partners have been founding companies in the 90s in gaming and media. And so they have a 2-decade history as founders and operators in the space. I can't obviously say the same thing for myself, but 20 years ago, I had pretty intense exposure to the industry from a player perspective and then picked it up at Goldman again in a very different way. But we've just been around for a while. And so even though it's so large of an industry, it still feels like a small family. You keep running into the same people. I know who you had on your podcast from the gaming industry. And obviously we know these people super well. We're probably co-invested in a couple of our investments too, or otherwise meet twice a year, 3 times a year at industry conferences, etc. So I think a lot of good investor acumen just comes from building intuition and pattern recognition over the years. You can be incredibly analytical and smart and still not have the benefit of having seen what works and what doesn't work. And so it just comes over time, I think. Definitely doesn't hurt to be analytical. I'm not saying that, but I think it certainly helps to just have seen 100 investment opportunities before you make your first investment, because then you can set everything into perspective. And on the partnerships, Delphi Digital is a great partner of ours, especially on the blockchain side. The idea there was to marry our deep gaming expertise with their long history in tokenomics and token design and on the pure play Web3 side of things, and combine that into an entity that would be able to advise especially Web3 games, not just from the game design and game building perspective, but also on the token design that was the idea there. We spent a lot on strategic partnerships with large media and tech companies. Some of them are also investors in BITKRAFT. You'd be surprised to hear some of those names because in many cases they have their own investment arms, but they aren't necessarily focused as early as we are. So they use BITKRAFT as kind of like the ears and eyes of the early stage landscape. And then once something hits, they build that relationship early with the startup and maybe come in as investors down the road. And generally, those can be acquirers of our companies, also in an exit scenario that isn't an IPO, but is a merger or an acquisition. And obviously for us, these are great relationships to have. And sometimes they're also a source for a new opportunity. We also receive investment opportunities through our partners. It's such a big world with so many people, with so many ambitions. It's actually really hard to see everything that's going on. We don't see everything, but we try and get as close to everything as possible.
Totally. I totally feel you. Okay, so we have a 1 minute fire round for you. Number one, what's your favorite book?
Recently, I liked How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I would say my second manager at IBM.
That's so specific. What did he do or she?
Was very invested in my personal career, was the first one to ask me to create a 10-year plan, was instrumental in getting me from Germany to the United States, got me on the radar with IBM CEO, wrote a recommendation letter for Stanford. Who
would you invite to your dinner party?
You can come.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Everyone who's hearing this, you're all invited. No, no, it's friends. And honestly, most of them don't have any relationship to the gaming industry. I try and keep my sanity.
Yeah. Where can we find you after work?
I usually have a mid-afternoon break where I go to the gym or I go for a run. I love working out. It's kind of like my meditation.
Yeah.
At least for an hour.
This is the time that you should fit into your marathon thing into this question. Okay, go.
Oh boy. Okay. So if you haven't been made painfully aware during this 1.5 hour conversation, I love to do crazy things and push the boundaries. And one of the ways in which this manifests is also I love to go on crazy running adventures with a good friend of mine. We went from marathon running to Ironman running to longer ultra distance races. In 2019, we did the Marathon des Sables, which is a self-sufficient 250-kilometer ultra marathon through the Sahara Desert, with the difficulty that you're not allowed to exchange any goods that you bring with any other competitors in the race. So you have to take care of your own food and shelter and navigation, etc. And in October this year, we're going out to run 7 marathons on 7 continents and doing all of that in 7 days, 7 subsequent days. So 168 hours to complete a marathon on each continent, starting in Antarctica. Mm-hmm. And, if you allow me, we're actually doing all of that to help with fundraising for so far treatment-resistant depression. So for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about the race, or maybe even feels generous today and wants to give to a good cause, and all of this is tax deductible, you can find us at wmfcharity.org. It's wmfcharity.org. Thank you.
Oh my God. Wow. Audience, definitely go check it out. Thank you so much, Moritz, for coming on the show today. It's been such a fun chat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.